Okay, it's one of my favorite times of year, and no, I'm not referring to Halloween. And don't get me wrong, I do enjoy some Halloween, and I'll be making sure to pick out an appropriate review for the end of the month to go along with it. But this week, we are celebrating college football season. Now, I know not everyone out there is a sports fan, and especially there's, plenty of people that aren't American football fans. But, when you grow up in the American South, it comes very easily. And while I like watching the NFL on Sundays or Mondays or Thursdays or Christmas, whatever other day they decide they want to show a game because they're the NFL and they can do whatever they want, apparently, there's just a different feel behind the college game. Even with the players getting paid now, as they should, I might add, with as much revenue as they bring into the schools and the broadcast networks, the college game still just has a different feel to it. Sure, in the NFL, you don't always know who's going to win a game, but usually if you've got a bad team playing a good team, the good team is going to take care of business. But in college, I don't know, it just seems like that there's, more of a bit of uncertainty to the proceedings. Sure, it's still football, and sure, a better team is more than likely going to win over a worse team, and this is especially true at home, where in college, home field advantage is, definitely stronger than in the pros. But every week, you're almost guaranteed that there's going to be some major upsets. Just this last weekend, an unranked Virginia beat number 8 Florida State, Arizona State took down number 24 TCU, Oregon beat Penn State on the road, although I suppose that one is arguable if it's an upset or not. Ole Miss beat LSU, and Alabama, who was dead and buried 3 weeks ago, beat Georgia at Georgia. However, I should probably pause for a second because, I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me, and, you're now annoyed because I'm probably rehashing some gambling losses here. Well, hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where, if you weren't aware, sports gambling is legal in Illinois. Believe me, I feel your pain. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. Now, previously on the channel, I've covered both the Genesis and Sega CD versions of Bill Walsh College Football and the Genesis version of Bill Walsh College Football 95, which, were all fun games, but I think if we're being honest, everyone knew that they were just the Madden games from those years with a college football coat of paint put on them, especially the original Bill Walsh College Football. Now, Bill Walsh 95 was a step forward, but with it only featuring 36 arguably random teams, it was clear it still wasn't its own product, at least not really. So how does one remedy this and try to make a new entrant into the series its own product, differentiating it from what came before? Well, the most obvious thing was to change the name, with the 1995 entry into the series now dropping the Bill Walsh naming rights and instead going by the new name, College Football USA 96. Now, granted, that was more to do with the 2-year naming rights contract being over, and, Bill Walsh was now retired after having 2 less than stellar years at Stanford, but note that Electronic Arts didn't try to find another Madden-like mascot for their college football series. Obviously, EA was going to have to do more to cater to college football fans with this year's edition of the game than just change the name. Did they do enough? Is College Football USA 96 substantially improved from Bill Walsh 95? Or is it still just essentially a modded version of Madden 95? Well, we'll take a look and see what else has changed, but first, a look at the package. And here's my copy of College Football USA 96 for the Genesis. This copy's in pretty nice shape. It's not perfect, as you can see some wear to the edges on the spine at the top and bottom, but other than that, the outer cover is relatively clean, and with this being an Electronic Arts clamshell, there is no hang tab to worry about at the top. Just like the outer cover, the inner cover is likewise fully intact, other than some very minor wear to the spine edges, and there's no water damage or sun bleaching anywhere to be seen. I'll definitely be holding on to this copy, but if you decide you want one for yourself, like most sports games on the Genesis, College Football USA 96 is very reasonable on the resale market, and you should be able to find a copy for, $12 or less, depending on condition. As far as the front cover goes, I wouldn't say this is my favorite layout, but I do think it's a solid cover, and I like the fact that they went with a collage showing off some of the best college teams of the previous year. For those of you not aware, we've got a band member from the national champion Nebraska Cornhuskers, and number 4 ranked Florida State, number 17 Michigan, a Trojan from number 12 Southern Cal, all surrounding a receiver from number 7 Kansas State. I think they did a great job of showcasing teams from all over the country, although I've got to say, it's a bit odd to look at in a 2025 lens with 0 teams representing the SEC. However, that also shows just how much things have changed in the college football landscape over the last 30 years. One final note about the front cover, this bright yellow megaphone-shaped sticker calling out 108 teams that you can't possibly miss. It's interesting to me that this was a sticker that was added to the cover rather than being part of the original design, almost as if the cover was designed and then locked in, and then after it went to press, some genius in marketing was like, hey, this is one of the key features about our game. Maybe we should, emphasize it on the cover? I don't know. Anyway, as you might expect, there is no other version of the cover out there, but interestingly, this wasn't technically a North American exclusive, as Portugal-based distributor Ecofilms, who was shown back in the review for Buggy Run in episode 273, did pick it up for Portugal. So I guess if you were in Europe at the time, you could have theoretically gotten a copy without leaving the continent. Flipping over the back, and there's the usual convoluted rear layout that EA was known for at this point, especially on their sports titles. I actually like it because it's wholly original and eye-catching, with a great mix of screenshots, both whole screen and then detail-oriented, data points to sell the game, and a caption for what's being shown in the pictures. And it's not just buzzword nonsense either. There's actual detail of what's included to tell you why you would want to buy the game. Opening up the package, and we've got the cartridge, manual, and an EA Sports specific product guide. The product guide is actually mildly interesting, as there's a reference to FIFA Soccer 96 for the 32X, which wasn't completely canceled as it did make it to stores in Europe, but the North American version shown here was never released, as I'm well aware of, due to the European version being one of 3 32X titles that I have yet to pick up for Zilog and Moto. Grumbling aside, the manual is exactly what you would expect from EA at this point. It's still somewhat beefy when it comes to explaining the game, as it should be with lots of options that we'll get to in the review, but even with that, they had figured out at this point that the console audience was different than the home computer audience, and they could afford to slim down the manuals a bit. I don't know that any players will really need to read the manual, especially if you are familiar with EA's other football games at the time, but it's definitely a nice to have. Okay, that's probably a bit too much about the package. Let's play some football. Just a quick technical note before we start discussing the game itself. When I started up the game for the first time to play it this week, I ran into a strange issue where I could not change the game mode from Exhibition. At first, I thought this was a problem with the game being designed for 3-button controllers, and perhaps I was needing to change into 3-button mode on my controller. Of course, on modern Retrobit and 8-bit DOE controllers, that also meant looking up the instructions of how to do that. However, after some research, the problem still remained, so I dug out one of my original 3-button controllers. That didn't work as well, so then it was off to Google. The only thing I could find was an AI summary that stated that some people had a similar issue when the battery on the cartridge died, which corrupted the save game data. Now, granted, those AI summaries are about as reliable as an Atari 5200 controller, but it actually turned out to be accurate in this case, and the battery needed to be replaced. Just throwing that out there in case anyone runs into a similar problem on either this or another game that uses a battery for save games. With a freshly installed battery, I was able to start to dig into what College Football USA 96 had to offer, and especially consider what it brought to the table that Bill Walsh College Football 95 didn't have. I've mentioned before in other reviews that I think the 16-bit era was where developers really figured out sports games, and we saw the greatest evolution in sports titles from a feature perspective. Of course, they still had a long way to go from a graphics standpoint, and there's been other things added over the course of the years, but when it comes down to what you actually had the ability to do in a sports game, most of those things started to show up in this era. So in some cases, it's pretty exciting to be able to experience a sports title doing something for the first time that we take for granted now. Beyond simply changing the name and the branding of the game that I referred to in the intro, the next most obvious difference between College Football USA 96 and Bill Walsh College Football 95 is the one that was called out on the front cover, albeit apparently belatedly. And that is the fact that for the first time we have a college football title that features every team from what was at the time referred to as Division 1A. If you're not from the U.S. and aren't familiar with college football, Division 1A is what is now referred to as the Football Bowl Subdivision, or FBS. But essentially what that means is that Division 1A is, or was, the top tier of college football and consisted of all the teams from the largest schools in the country. For the 1995 season, to capture every team from Division 1A, you had to cover 108 teams, hence the number on the sticker on the cover. Bill Walsh College Football 95, on the other hand, only featured 36 of those 108 teams, meaning that College Football USA 96 now had a staggering 3 times as many teams as the previous game. Even if you don't know anything about college football, I think you would be able to appreciate what a substantial upgrade that is. If you are a college football fan, though, the change is even more endearing, because while I appreciate the previous game trying to select, who they thought were the 36 most interesting teams were, I guess, how they determined which 36 teams that was always going to be up for interpretation. For instance, why include Michigan and not Michigan State? Clemson and not South Carolina? Georgia and not Georgia Tech? USC, Stanford, and Cal, but then not UCLA? Or why include any of the service academies at all, as Air Force, Army, and Navy haven't been national championship caliber since World War II? Including all 108 teams finally makes College Football USA 96 feel like a fully complete product, rather than just an all-star contest. Also, with all the teams included, now all of the major conferences can be included as well, leading to season schedules that align, or at least similar to, what a team would experience in real life, rather than just some random mishmash of teams that you had before. This might seem like a small detail if you're not a college football fan, but let me put it in soccer terms. Having conference play be available now gives, say, a Premiership team a schedule of games against Aston Villa, Chelsea, Everton, and Manchester United, instead of, one of those teams, but then also randomly mixing in Stuttgart, Juventus, and Mallorca. Some solid soccer action would be had there to be sure, but not exactly a good representation of real life. As nice as it is to be playing a game that now feels more complete, the designers weren't done with the upgrades. From a gameplay perspective, while the game largely plays the same as the previous year, meaning that fans of the previous games will have no issues picking up and playing the game right away, there are some nice additions that, in some cases, drastically change the feel of the game. On the smaller side of things, each team now has a 45-player roster, which means that every position has a backup available, in case there's an injury, or if you just want to try giving a bench player a shot instead. And you can even customize which players are used in which formations by default, so if you want to emphasize a speedier backup at running back rather than the bruising starter, you can do that. Next, the designers have implemented a new optional passing mode. Previously, when dropping back to pass, you would have markers pop up over 3 of your receivers, and then hit A, B, or C to pass to that receiver. However, frequently, pass plays are designed with 4 and 5 receivers available, meaning that under the old system, you'd have players that, even if they happen to be open, you could never pass to. College Football USA 96 attempts to remedy this by adding a system similar to what's used in Tecmo Super Bowl, where rather than press a button for a specific receiver, you instead hit the B button to iterate through all of the available receivers, and then the C button to pass when you're on the one that you want. I've got to be honest, I love the idea in theory, and I'm glad that they included it for people to try out, but cycling through the options takes time which you probably are risking a sack by taking, rather than just utilizing the old direct method. The final gameplay change is one that will probably affect your game the most if you decide to use it, and that's College Football USA 96's enhanced penalties. Previously, Bill Walsh 95 had a very basic penalty system that, for the most part, really just consisted of offsides calls to keep the game honest. In fact, if you look at the manual for Bill Walsh 95, penalties aren't even mentioned a single time that I can tell. However, in the case of College Football USA 96, we got penalties. Pass interference, roughing the passer, both the 5 and 15-yard face mask calls, and the one that you'll probably see in the game most, holding. These are all randomly generated for the most part, so just like in a real-life game, you never know when someone is going to get caught making a mistake and then completely shift the rhythm of a drive. Even when this didn't work out in my favor, for instance, I definitely got 2 holding calls back-to-back when on offense a time or two, I really love the added realism here. I think one of my favorite situations I ran into this last week when playing the game was being lined up to punt on 4th and down, and then all of a sudden the computer jumps off sides, giving me a first down. This is stuff that happens in real games, and this, along with the other additions to the game, really drives home the feeling of watching college football on TV. The gameplay additions aren't the only major changes to the game, as the graphic engine has been overhauled as well. Previously in Bill Walsh 95, EA had still been using the original John Madden football game engine, just tweaked to fit the college game. This wasn't a bad thing necessarily, but by mid-1995, it was definitely starting to show its age, as in the meantime, both Madden NFL 94 and 95 had been released using an updated graphics engine that featured much better performance and animation for the players. Thankfully, Electronic Arts decided that with the change in branding, it was also a good time to go ahead and upgrade to the newer graphics engine as well, with the result being that College Football USA 96 now looked on par with its professional sibling. I'll admit, the newer player sprites take a few minutes to get used to, but once you do, it's hard to go back to the bulky, slow-moving performance of the previous titles. While we're on the subject of graphics, I do have one very, very minor complaint, and that's the addition of the CGI images of refs that are displayed when a penalty is called or when it's the end of a quarter. With the rest of the game either using hand-drawn graphics or digitized pictures for some of these scoreboard animations, the CGI polygonal refs stand out like a sore thumb in comparison to everything else that's going on. And, of course, with this being 1985, they don't look great to begin with. It's almost like EA decided that since the 32-bit era had started, they had to somehow give a nod to what was coming, but I don't like it. Of all the things that were fixed and improved from the previous release to this one, this was something that did not need to be touched. But again, very incredibly minor complaint that some people might not even notice unless it's pointed out to them. The sound in game is still solid as well. I don't think there's really been any major changes in sound from Bill Walsh 95 to College Football USA 96, but there didn't really need to be either. Each team does feature a specific fight song that's played whenever they score, and with the addition of now 72 more teams, my guess is that there were some fight songs that they added to the game to go along with that. But I really certainly didn't sit down and try to figure out what was added and what wasn't. Either way, having that level of customization for the teams to go along with the uniforms and the logos is nice. Probably the thing that stood out the most to me sonically, though, is how clear the limited digital speech in the game is. There is no rough FM-based samples here. When the game says, "It's good," after a successful field goal, it is, indeed, good. The telltale sign of when I'm reviewing a game for the channel that it's of good quality is when I personally play the game way, way more than I actually need to for the review purposes. Usually for these 8 and 16-bit titles, with the exception of, say, strategy or role-playing games, you really only need to play them for between 3 to 5 hours, depending on how simple the game is, to fully experience the game and get a feel for what they got right and what possibly went horribly wrong. But when there's a good game in the queue that I truly enjoy playing, I find myself playing it more, possibly, to not even record footage, just to have fun. In 2025, this means also that I'm probably playing the game instead of a newer title on the Xbox. For instance, here specifically, I own a copy of EA Sports College Football 25. I could easily be playing that with 4K graphics and all the bells and whistles that go along with a modern game, but no, I've spent my time this week working through a fictional 1996 season instead, chasing after the National Championship and the MVP award, aka Heisman Trophy. And I'm doing this because, with all due respect to Bill Walsh College Football and Bill Walsh 95, College Football USA 96 feels like it's when the EA Sports college football franchise really became the series that caused people to spend over $100 for NCAA Football 14 during the series hiatus. Other than very minor details here and there, this was the game where EA got everything right for the first time, and due to that, I'm giving it 4 stars. If you like sports and you own a Genesis, this game should be in your collection, especially due to how reasonably priced it is. And that's it for College Football USA 96 for the Genesis. Now, this was a game that I was very curious about for a long time due to its somewhat generic retitling, but thankfully the removal of anything associated with Bill Walsh was all replaced with good things. It's not often when I can play a game from 30 years ago and get the feeling like, man, if the graphics and sound were updated to modern standards, I would play this game today. It's, that good and that revolutionary for its time. Next time on the channel, well, I'll admit, I'm kind of getting a whiplash going back and forth between, really great games and then really terrible games. 2 weeks ago, it was the excellent Master System version of Sonic the Hedgehog, and then last week, it was the awful, barely a game of Ishido the Way of Stones for the Genesis, and then, of course, back to the excellent with College Football USA 96 this last week. If that pattern holds, I've got a really bad feeling about next week's review. I think it's going to leave me quite bored. Maybe I'll do the school book review thing with it and watch the movie instead so I don't have to actually, play the game. I should do that instead. Maybe this time I'll figure out which of the endings is actually the real one. Anyway, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 302. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.